Our first speaker, Ryan T. Anderson, researches and writes about justice and moral principles in economic thought, healthcare, and education as the William E. Simon Fellow in Religion and a Free Society at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. He's also the editor of Public Discourse, the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, New Jersey, and the co-author with Princeton's Robert George and Sharif Girgis of What is Marriage, Man, Woman, a Defense? Anderson's previous positions include Assistant Director of First Things, Journalism Fellow at the Phillips Foundation, and Executive Director of the Witherspoon Institute, where he was Research Assistant to Robert George and Jean Bethke Elstein. His articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, First Things, the Weekly Standard, National Review, among others. He received his BA from Princeton University, graduating Phi Beta Kappa and magna cum laude, and received his doctorate degree in political philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. Ryan?
I want to start, as any good conservative should, by turning back the clock 50 years. And I'm glad you laughed. It's early in the morning on a Thursday, but this shows you're attentive. I want to turn back the clock 50 years to the Moynihan Report. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, he writes a report on the state of the black family in the United States. And he points out that births to single mothers in the general population were 5%, but within the African-American community, they were 25%. And he said, something's gone wrong. Something's gone wrong within that community, something gone wrong with that understanding of human sexuality, that understanding of marriage. He's then roundly criticized for being a racist. They say Senator Moynihan is blaming the victim. Senator Moynihan's doing this because he has antagonism, animus, prejudice, bigotry against African Americans. The exact opposite's the case. Moynihan was a liberal professor of sociology at Harvard University. He was a Democrat senator from the state of New York. He wrote his report precisely because he cared about African Americans and he cared about the family, and he saw that if the family broke down in that community, a whole host of other consequences in terms of poverty and social mobility and crime and education and employment would be the consequences, and he cared about all of those things. He was a former Secretary of Labor. I think he was actually Secretary of Labor when he wrote the report. So this is why he does this. Fast forward to today. Remember the statistics I mentioned, it was 5% general population, 25% African American population. Today it's 40% of all American children born to single mothers, 50% of the Hispanic community, and it's over 70% of the African American community. Gays and lesbians aren't to blame for this. Those realities are consequences of heterosexuals who bought into a liberal ideology about sex and marriage and then failed to live out the truth about marriage. The reason I open this way is that the redefinition of marriage by 5 unelected judges this past June simply takes the logic of that 50-year change from the Moynihan Report till today and enshrines it into our constitutional law. It's not that gays and lesbians are to blame for the breakdown of the family, it's that the breakdown of the family and the ideas that animated the breakdown of the family is the same vision of human sexuality and of marriage that was then adopted by those who were pushing to legally redefine marriage, and then runs all throughout Justice Kennedy's majority opinion. When you read Justice Kennedy's opinion, it's as if you're reading one of the liberal ideologues from the 60s, from the sexual revolution. So the phrase, love makes a family, is not something that gay rights activists came up with in the past decade as the various state marriage battles were taking place. That is something that activists in the 60s gave us as part of the sexual revolution. The idea that marriage should last as long as the love lasts, again, that's not something that the LGBT movement gave us. That's something that heterosexuals gave us, who had bought into a bad understanding of the human person and of the human family. Why this matters is that if you think the past 50 years have been a good thing for America's children, for America's women, mothers, wives, for society at large, then you can cheer the extension of that logic by the Supreme Court. If you think the past 50 years have been a bad thing for America's children, for America's wives and mothers, for society as a whole, then you might be more hesitant to see judges enshrining it into our Constitution. Because it's that vision of sexuality that gave us the normalization of premarital sex, the rise of cohabitation, the increase in non-marital childbearing, the introduction of no-fault divorce laws, the more than doubling in the rates of divorce. If you think those consequences aren't all good things, to put it mildly, you might be skeptical about locking in that vision into the Constitution. So what I want to share this morning are some lessons of what we should do now. I think last night, if I understand it correctly, Professor George said, unfortunately, what's the logic and the psychologic, the logical and the psychological consequences of the legal redefinition of marriage? I want to suggest what we can do to try to prevent some of those consequences. What can we do practically to make a difference, to hopefully reform our marriage culture and our marriage laws to strengthen families? And what I want to do is I want to draw lessons from the pro-life movement. It was around this time last year that I started writing a book titled Truth Overruled, The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom. That's the title of this session as well, because this is largely drawn from that book. And like most thinking people, I think we knew that Justice Kennedy was going to rule with the 4 liberal Supreme Court justices and redefine marriage. So this time last year, I said, all right, if come June we get the Roe v. Wade of marriage, what should we do in response? And in thinking through how to answer that question, I looked to, well, what did the pro-life movement do successfully after Roe v. Wade to make it easy to be a pro-lifer today in the United States? That 40 years ago when Roe v. Wade was decided, all of the talking heads said the Supreme Court has settled the abortion issue, that a generation from now, all of the young people will be pro-choice, that the last pro-lifers would be in nursing homes and inside of the Vatican. And all of those talking heads got it wrong, right? Your generation's more pro-life than your parents' generation. And the reason why is because of the work that your parents' generation did. So right now, all the talking heads are saying that the Supreme Court has settled the marriage debate. And they're saying that a generation from now, all of the young people will be in favor of this new understanding of marriage. And the last kind of traditionalists will be inside of the Vatican, maybe inside of Salt Lake City, and in nursing homes. What can we do to prove those talking heads wrong? The future isn't a blind force. The future is something that we are active participants in shaping. So as I was researching the book, I drew 3 large lessons from the pro-life movement. So if you're taking notes, you can organize it in 3 large parts. And I'll just mention the last part's going to be multi-pronged. And depending on time, we'll see how many of those prongs I get to. But I want to leave time for your questions and hopefully some answers. So the first lesson from the pro-life movement is that they rejected Roe v. Wade. They did not accept Roe v. Wade as the last word. They said that Roe v. Wade tells a lie both about the United States Constitution and a lie about unborn human life. They said that there's nothing in the actual text or logic or structure of the US Constitution that guarantees a right to an abortion. That there isn't anything properly understood that says, in this case it was 7 unelected judges, could simply rewrite the abortion laws in all 50 states. And the reason I mention that is that we lost 5-4, the pro-lifers lost 7-2. So at least we have a closer ruling. We also got 4 magnificent dissenting opinions. And as if you noticed at Justice Scalia's funeral, all of the commentators were saying he was writing his dissents for you, for students, for future law students, for generations of law students to come. His dissent will still be read in the Obergefell decision in a way that Justice Kennedy's will not. Law professors find it embarrassing to try to teach and defend Justice Kennedy's opinion. They say, we agree with the outcome, but the logic and the reasoning is embarrassing. And Scalia and Roberts and Alito and Thomas, all 4 of them wrote their own dissenting opinions, pointing out various aspects of the flaws. They've given us some ammunition here to explain why the court got this case wrong, why it got the Constitution wrong, why it got marriage wrong. What's important from the pro-life movement here is that they said this isn't an issue that is the domain of the eminent tribunal of the courts. And so every year for the past 42 years, 43 years now, hundreds of thousands of Americans come to Washington, D.C. on January 22nd. And they don't come because that's when the cherry blossoms are blooming. The cherry blossoms are blooming right now. They don't come in the middle of January because the weather is great, because airfare is cheap. They come then because that's the anniversary of Roe v. Wade. They frequently come in the middle of blizzards, as they did this past year. And they're there to bear witness to the truth. They're there to bear witness that the court got this wrong. It's continuing to perpetuate an injustice against the unborn Americans who are denied the law's equal protection. And they're there to send a signal. And little by little, the pro-life movement has made progress in undoing that court precedent. First with the Born Alive Infant Protection Act, then with the partial birth abortion ban. It took them twice, 2 attempts to do that. The first time they banned partial birth abortion, the Supreme Court struck it down as unconstitutional. They did it a second time, they went back to the court, and it was upheld as constitutional. Right now, you're seeing states that are banning abortion at 20 weeks. The federal government's about halfway there. The House has passed it. The Senate hasn't taken it up yet. You're seeing states that are saying abortion clinics need to meet the same surgical standards and ambulatory centers as other medical centers. A variety of ways to slowly back up the abortion license of Roe. We need to learn from the pro-life movement how to do that on the marriage case. How to deny the ability of the court to say it gets the last word, and how, particularly as a teaching function, not to allow the court to shape the opinions, the beliefs, and the self-understanding of future Americans. You'll see right after Roe, opinion changes. The court taught something about abortion, that it was a constitutional right and therefore a moral right. And the generation who came of age at the time of Roe v. Wade, they're the ones that are most pro-choice because of the law's teaching function. We need to prevent that from happening here. We need to say that the court got it wrong. Second lesson, the next thing the pro-life movement did was that they protected their freedom. The pro-life movement said, the Supreme Court has just created a constitutional right to choose to have an abortion. But that needs to be balanced by a right to choose not to perform an abortion, not to have an abortion, not to pay for an abortion. And so 6 months after the Roe v. Wade decision, Congress passed what was known as the Church Amendment. The Church Amendment was not named for buildings made out of stone or brick with steeples and stained glass windows and bell towers. It was named for the senator from Idaho, a Democrat, Frank Church. And what took place in Congress in June of 1973 was that they said, we are supposed to be a check and a balance on the court. The reason we have 3 branches of government is so that we can check and balance each other. The court has now issued its ruling on abortion. We're going to place one check on the court by saying the federal government will never force someone to perform an abortion. Later with the Hyde Amendment, named for Congressman Henry Hyde, it said that no taxpayer funds could be used to pay for an abortion. Later with the Weldon Amendment, named for Senator Weldon, it went beyond just doctors and nurses to any healthcare professional could never be forced to assist in an abortion or to be forced to learn about how to perform an abortion. So if you're a med school student, you wouldn't be forced into training to be an abortionist. This was vitally important for several reasons. One is that it was a bipartisan attempt. They were able to get both Democrats and Republicans to support this. They were able to get both pro-lifers and pro-choicers to agree to this. They were able to say, even if you're in favor of an abortion, you're pro-choice, do you need to coerce me into violating my beliefs about the dignity of unborn human life? What is it about your right to an abortion that says I have a duty to perform your abortion or to pay for your abortion? And they were able to win that argument. There's largely been a consensus about this for the past 40 years. What's so remarkable about the HHS contraception mandate, what's so remarkable about yesterday's Supreme Court case involving the Little Sisters of the Poor, was that this was one of the first times since Roe v. Wade that consensus had been violated. The Obama administration's, first the assault on Hobby Lobby, now on the Little Sisters, was actually going to force people to violate their core convictions about the sanctity of life. There's also a lawsuit right now from the ACLU suing one of the largest networks of Catholic hospitals because they don't perform abortions. So these issues are now being re-litigated, and I think partly because it's a proxy war for the religious liberty on the marriage issue. Because that's where I think the rubber actually is hitting the road here. Because where you're no longer seeing the bipartisan consensus on religious liberty is what's the status of BYU's law school when it comes to its accreditation? What's the status of a Catholic hospital that won't do in vitro fertilization for a same-sex couple? What's the status of an evangelical school like Gordon College that has a campus policy about sexual activity that says no sex outside of marriage, marriage is understood as the union of a husband and a wife? What's the status of Catholic charity adoption agencies that won't do same-sex adoptions, only do mother-father adoptions? What's the status of the baker, the florist, the photographer, the marriage counselor that can't help celebrate or affirm a same-sex wedding? Those are the religious liberty cases where now we see voices on the left who otherwise have been in favor of religious liberty coming out against it. It was this week last year that Indiana passed its Religious Freedom Restoration Act. This was a bill that was sponsored in the House of Representatives by then Representative Chuck Schumer, now Senator Schumer. It was sponsored in the Senate by Senator Ted Kennedy. It was passed unanimously in the House. It passed with 97 votes in the Senate. Bill Clinton signed it into law with the ACLU and the Roman Catholic bishops both praising it. And then 20-some years later, when Indiana passes the exact same law at the state level, now Senator Schumer was sending out tweets saying how bad the law is. Hillary Clinton, the wife of the president who signed it into law, was saying how we should be boycotting Indiana. The NCAA said we might have to pull out the Final Four from Indiana. Georgia has passed a similar law, and right now the NFL is saying that it might have to change the location of the Super Bowl if the governor doesn't veto it. Various groups from Hollywood, including Disney, are saying we might boycott the state of Georgia and the city of Atlanta unless you veto this bill. So what had been a broad consensus, the government shouldn't coerce sincere religious beliefs unless it's doing so for a compelling state interest in the least restrictive way possible. That's the legal test here. It's not an absolute rule, it's a balancing test. A common sense religious liberty law is now being demagogued by the left because they want to say on this issue, on the issue of the redefinition of marriage, no dissent should be tolerated. And let me just talk a little more in depth about what some of those cases look like. The first religious liberty violation that that gained public prominence was Catholic charity adoption agencies in Boston. Catholic charities have been taking care of widows and orphans for about 2,000 years, for longer than the nation state has existed. But the state of Massachusetts said, we've now redefined marriage. We have an anti-discrimination statute that elevates sexual orientation to a protected class like race. You are discriminating. You're violating our anti-discrimination ordinance if you don't treat same-sex couples the same way as you treat married moms and dads. Catholic Charity says, well, look, we have social science that show that moms and dads aren't interchangeable, so that two moms and two dads aren't the same thing as a mom and a dad, and we think we should do what's in the best interest of the children who are entrusted to our care. We also have religious liberty in this country. And the government said, no, you don't have a, quote, right to discriminate. And they were denied an adoption license. In this country, you can't run an adoption clinic without an adoption license, so they were forced to shut down. This does nothing to help children find homes. Catholic Charities wasn't trying to prevent same-sex couples from adopting from the government-run adoption agency. They weren't trying to prevent same-sex couples from adopting from the secular humanist adoption agency. All they said is, for the children who've been entrusted to us, we want to be free from government coercion to find them homes with married moms and dads, and the state said no. What's particularly remarkable here is that whether you chalk this up to grace or to Catholic guilt, so whether you're a believer or a skeptic, however you account for this phenomenon, Catholic Charities had the most successful track record at placing the hardest to place children into homes. Everyone wants to adopt the newborn baby, cute, cuddly. Not many people want to adopt the 7 or 8-year-old boy with behavioral problems. The kid who's been bouncing around from foster home to foster home, who's been kicked out of school for behavioral problems. And yet Catholic Charities was able to get people to be more generous, to open up their hearts and their homes, to be more loving, more welcoming than other agencies were able to. Again, chalk it up either to grace or to Catholic guilt. They're no longer able to do that in Massachusetts, in Illinois, in San Francisco, and in Washington, D.C., where I live. In all 4 jurisdictions, the government has said that's illegal discrimination. Next involve, so those are some of the charity examples. Next involve universities, schools, including law schools. During oral arguments, Justice Alito said to the Solicitor General of the United States, Don Verrilli, he said, "What's going to happen to Christian schools who continue to teach and have policies based on marriage being the union of husband and wife? Will they lose their nonprofit tax status the way that Bob Jones University did?" Now, Bob Jones University is an evangelical school that had a ban on interracial dating. The IRS revoked their nonprofit tax status, saying we don't give nonprofit tax status to racists, to bigots. You're not serving the purpose of nonprofit classification, which is helping to serve the common good. You're actually detracting from it. We're denying you the nonprofit status. Bob Jones sued. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, no, you don't have a religious liberty right to be a racist. He says, is that going to happen to Orthodox Jewish, Roman Catholic, Evangelical, Latter-day Saint schools? And the answer from the Solicitor General was pretty chilling. I was in the courtroom, and you could almost sense that people weren't quite expecting that answer. What he said was, I don't deny it, Justice Alito, that's going to be an issue. I don't deny it, it's going to be an issue. What he could have said is, of course not, Justice Alito. We would never treat all of these Abrahamic faith traditions that believe we're created male and female and that male and female are created for each other, we would never treat them as if they're racists. You know, obviously that belief about sexual complementarity, about male, female, husband, wife, mother, father, is radically different than racism. And so we would never instruct the IRS or any other government agency to treat religious schools that way. He could have said that. That's not what he said. What he more or less said was, we're going to cross that bridge when we get there. We're going to play that card when and if it's convenient. So whether that's the remaining 10 months of the current administration, whether that's the next 4 or 8 years of a Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders administration, who knows? But they want to hold on to that possibility. The reason you should be concerned about this is that the American Bar Association is currently investigating your law school here at BYU as to whether or not it deserves to retain its accreditation. A complaint's been filed with the Bar Administration saying that because BYU has certain beliefs about marriage and it has certain expectations from faculty, staff, and students with respect to marriage, that it's discriminating against gay and lesbian students and staff members. And therefore, it shouldn't be an accredited law school. If you don't go to an ABA accredited law school, you can't sit for the bar. Right? So if you're not accredited by the Bar Association, you're not eligible to take the bar exam. So you can see how there are various ways, whether it's going to be your nonprofit tax status, your accreditation, or your funding. There are only 3 universities, 3 colleges in the United States that don't accept any government funding. It's Hillsdale, it's Grove City, Christendom, actually, and there's a 4th, Wyoming Catholic College. All 4 of them are small liberal arts schools. None of the universities can, because the way that the government has structured the financing of higher education, it's virtually impossible to engage in university-level education without receiving government funding. To try to run a science lab, to try to do graduate school, to try to do kind of fundamental research is rather expensive, and they structure the tax code that they overtax us, and then they give us back some of our tax money with strings attached. And so the question now would be, will some of those strings that are attached be your beliefs about marriage and about human sexuality? So even there, take the example of Hillsdale. They don't take government money, but they could lose their nonprofit tax status. And what would happen if all of the alumni giving to Hillsdale was now taxable income? What would happen to your campus if you had to pay property taxes? Just think about all of the financial regulatory pressures the government can bring to bear on you because you have incorrect views about marriage. The last example that I want to talk about are the professionals. The bakers, the florists, the photographers, wedding counselors. People who say, well, look, my religion isn't just about what I do Sunday morning inside of church. It's not just what I do in a charity or in a school. It's what I do Monday through Friday as well. My religion impacts every aspect of my life. I'm called to discipleship. I'm called to stewardship of my God-given gifts and talents, and how I use these gifts and talents, how I live out my life every day of the week matters. And I'm accountable to God with how I use these gifts and talents every day of the week. So while, to give you 2 examples, while the 71-year-old grandmother, Baronelle Stutzman, has no problem baking a happy birthday cake, or she's a florist, so let me use the floral examples, doing happy birthday flowers or get well soon flowers for same-sex customers, she had an objection to doing wedding flowers for same-sex customers. What's interesting about Barronell's story is that she's employed gay employees in her floral studio. She had no problem hiring gay people. She was selling flowers to this particular gay couple for a decade. She had no problem selling flowers to them for other occasions. It was only after Washington State redefined marriage that one of the partners came in and said, Barronell, we're getting married, can you do our wedding flowers? She sat down with him, she said, Roger, you know how much I love you guys, but I can't do a same-sex wedding. Because of my relationship with Jesus, I'm accountable with my gifts and talents, and I can't use God-given gifts to help celebrate what I believe undermines and isn't in accord with God's intentions for what marriage is. She was then sued by the state attorney general, saying that she had violated the rights of the same-sex couple who wanted her to make these flowers. She's lost all of her cases so far. It's been appealed to the state Supreme Court, and the state Supreme Court has announced that they will review it. Just 2 days ago, Sharif Gerges, my co-author, and I were filing an amicus brief in that case, and we were finalizing that brief to be submitted there, showing why this isn't like racism. But she's been sued in both her personal and her professional capacity. So at age 71, she can lose both her business and her home. That's what is at stake here. And the reason I mention both the personal and the professional capacity, because in the neighboring state of Oregon, there's a young evangelical family. They're in their early 40s, Aaron and Melissa Klein. They have 4 or 5 kids. I've lost track in the past couple of years. They were supporting their growing family with a little cake shop. It was called Sweet Cakes by Melissa. And they bake custom-ordered cakes for a variety of occasions. They were asked to do a same-sex wedding cake. They had to decline. They were sued, and they were ordered to pay a $135,000 fine. $135,000. In addition to that, they had social media boycotts, and they were being harassed and picketed and protested. They were forced to shut down their cake shop. Aaron is now supporting the family as a trash collector, making half what they used to make when they were running their bakery. So lives and livelihoods and vocations are at stake here. What it seems to me we need to do is we need to form alliances with people who disagree with us about marriage. To say, look, even if you're in favor of same-sex marriage, what justifies the government in saying that this baker, this florist, this photographer has to violate their beliefs about marriage? If your argument for the past decade was about freedom to love and the right to marry, isn't there also a corollary right of freedom to operate your business in accordance with your beliefs? Freedom to not be coerced into violating your beliefs about marriage. Is freedom a two-way street here, or is it a one-way ratchet? I'm not delusional. I know the activists, the ideologues on the left, are going to answer the way they're going to answer, which is no, quote, right to discriminate. But reasonable liberals, reasonable people in favor of same-sex marriage are horrified when they hear about Catholic charities being shut down, when they hear about the harassment that Gordon College and BYU's law school, those sorts of things. When they hear about the baker, the florist, the photographer, they say, I thought I was voting in favor of pluralism and diversity and tolerance and living and let living. What we need to do is appeal to those people to form alliances with us to say, even while we disagree about marriage, we can agree about freedom. We can agree about religious freedom in particular. 2 weeks ago, I spoke at CPAC, which is the large conservative political action committee conference each year. And it was a panel with, it was myself and a Lutheran, both of us in favor of marriage, understood as a union of man and woman. And then it was a gay conservative, obviously in favor of gay marriage, and then a libertarian, also in favor of gay marriage. So the 4 of us, we disagree about marriage. All 4 of us agree about the liberty aspect here. And so it was powerful when a gay conservative was saying, I hope one day to get married, but I don't want to force a particular baker or florist who disagrees with me into catering my wedding. And I don't want to force Catholic charities into adopting, placing a child with us. And I don't want to force Catholic schools or evangelical schools or Mormon schools into changing their teaching or changing their campus policies. That freedom needs to go in both directions on this issue. We need to form those types of strategic alliances in the way that the pro-life movement did with pro-choicers. Which leads to the third lesson from the pro-life movement. And that's that we have to make the case for marriage, just like the pro-life movement made the case for life. The pro-life movement didn't rest content saying, all right, we've protested Roe v. Wade, we said the Supreme Court got it wrong, we've now protected our rights not to have to perform abortions, and now we're done. The pro-life movement said those were just kind of the preliminary steps to do the real work, which is rebuilding a culture of life, which is bearing witness to the truth about life, both in law and in culture. And this is particularly important because I actually think you can't do those first two steps without doing this latter step. My average classmate at Princeton, Professor George can verify this, secular, liberal, progressive, in favor of abortion rights, a pro-choice individual. But they're mainly not in favor of forcing Catholic hospitals to perform abortions or forcing an evangelical nurse to assist in an abortion. And the reason why is that even though they disagree with me and Professor George about abortion, they understand why we believe what we believe about abortion. So they can say, I think Professor George is wrong about unborn human life, but I understand his argument, and I can see how if I believe what he believes about that unborn child, I wouldn't want the government forcing me to perform an abortion. Now, despite the best of my efforts and Professor George's efforts, my average classmate at Princeton still doesn't understand what I believe about marriage. They think the Westboro Baptist Church speaks for me, and they think the Westboro Baptist Church speaks for you. And so if you've never gone to church in your life, if you've never read the Bible, if all you know about Christian beliefs on marriage is God hates fags, how are you going to respond to the adoption agency, to the school, to the baker, the florist, and the photographer? You're much more likely to say, these people are evil, these people are crazy, and the government has to stop it. The government has to eliminate it. That what's being taught at your university is Westboro Baptist Church theology. So at a cultural level, and we have to remember that religious liberty debates, there's going to be a legal battle, sincere religious belief, compelling state interests, least restrictive way possible, all of the kind of legal jargon, but there's also a court of public opinion battle that takes place. And at the court of public opinion, most people say, if you're evil, if you're crazy, if you're delusional, if you're causing harm to other people the way that the Westboro Baptist Church is, you don't deserve to have your religious freedom rights protected. That's what the cultural message was in the Bob Jones University case. And so one of the challenges for us is going to be, can we bear witness to the truth about marriage in a way that even our neighbors who don't share all of aspects of our worldview can understand? Are we going to be able to explain why both the Westboro Baptist Church is wrong? They're engaged in formal heresy, because God hates no one. So their placards at the funeral is a formal heretical statement. They're wrong, but also Anthony Kennedy's wrong. Right? Each of them are getting marriage and the family wrong in various ways, and here's what the truth is. And so what I want to do is go through a couple of concrete examples in this third lesson from the pro-life movement. First, pro-lifers were able to make both the sacred and the secular argument about life, both the philosophical and the theological argument about life. We need to be able to do the same, right? So it's important that you know your theology of marriage. It's important that you know what the Bible says about marriage. It's also important that you know what human reason says about marriage, that you can respond to someone who doesn't share any of your theological commitments with an argument on the basis of reason as to why marriage is a union of husband and wife. The pro-life movement, they developed all sorts of training modules and various programs to teach people how to make the case for life in a way that's accessible to people who don't share our theological convictions. We need to do the same on marriage. And I know actually some graduates of BYU have actually done this. They've taken the arguments that Robbie, George, Sharif, and I made in What is Marriage and created a website, what was it called, Discussing Marriage or Debating Marriage, and very helpfully putting it into kind of like a point-counterpoint format. These are things, we need these things to blossom in many different ways. We also need to be able to make not just the response to the same-sex marriage part, but to the marriage part. Remember, I opened by talking about the Moynihan Report. I opened by talking about premarital sex and cohabitation and non-marital childbearing and the high rates of adultery and divorce. It's only after 50 years of heterosexuals making a mess of this that it was even logically plausible for 5 judges to legally redefine marriage. They say, well, if you're not taking monogamy seriously, if you're not taking permanence seriously, if you're not taking exclusivity seriously, why should we take complementarity seriously? So part of the task here is going to be a holistic response to the sexual revolution. And this is why groups like Fidelio here at BYU, the Love and Fidelity Network, various groups, Anscombe societies that are responding not just to same-sex marriage, but to the hookup culture, to the pornography epidemic, to various ways in which love and the family have broken down. And that's one of the things that Professor Brudaszewski's talk later this morning is really when he talks about this holistically. What are the laws of sex, not just with respect to same-sex marriage, but with respect to the 97% of the population that identifies as straight. What are the various ways that we're getting love and family and marriage wrong? Second lesson from pro-life movement in this subsection is that science is our friend. The pro-life movement, they relied on the science of embryology, developmental biology, ultrasound. We need not be fearful of the best of secular disciplines like science. The same thing's going to be true on marriage. In the long run, social scientists like Dr. Regnerus at the University of Texas at Austin, and like Dr. Paul Sullins at CUA, Jason Carroll, Joe Price, some of your own professors here at BYU, they will be vindicated. Because all of the best social science that we have to date, the ones that use large, random, representative samples, show that the best place for a child to develop is in a relationship with their biological married mother and father. We had 40 years of science like this before the question of same-sex marriage took place. And they tested every permutation, every alternative family structure. And all of the best social science showed children do best with their married mother and father. Then the question of same-sex marriage came up. They started changing what the expectations of the standards for social science were. They weren't using large, random, representative samples. They certainly weren't doing longitudinal studies. They were using snowball samplings, convenience sampling techniques. And then the media headlines were that there's no difference between mother-fathering and same-sex parenting. And that if anything, lesbians tend to actually parent better than mothers and fathers. Those were what the headlines were showing. Then Mark Regnerus at the University of Texas, Austin, was the first social scientist to say, wait, let's actually use a large random representative sample, see what the outcomes are. And then Paul Sullins at CUA, and then various other social scientists using Canadian census data, American data, including your faculty members here at BYU, what their conclusions are so far is that even when compared to same-sex parenting, children still do best with their married biological mothers and fathers. And the reason why, it tends to be three kind of, you want to do causal vectors. Biology matters, gender matters, and stability matters. That having a double biological connection with a child matters. Having gender complementary parenting matters. There's no such thing as parenting, there's mothering and there's fathering. And that mothers and fathers interact with kids in different ways. And then stability matters. So why is cohabitation, why is divorce and remarriage doesn't actually produce the same outcome as marriage? Because it's not a particularly stable environment. And I know the next speaker is going to focus more on some of those aspects, so I'll move more quickly through that. But we need to learn those arguments. We need to know how to respond when our friend says, well, the APA says there's no difference. Can we explain, actually, that's not the best science. This is what the best science shows. I should mention that the first two chapters of Truth Overruled do the philosophical argument. Chapter 7 is a nice summary of the social science. You can get it on Amazon today, I think, for $8 or $9, and I get a nickel for each copy that is sold. So if all of you buy one, I might be able to get a cup of coffee at the airport this afternoon. Third subsection point, personal stories matter. The pro-life movement did a great job by finding the right spokespeople. We don't want to have old, angry, gray-haired white males being the only people who talk about abortion. And so you look at groups that have been founded, Women Speak for Themselves, Helen Alvarez group. You look at activists like Lila Rose. It's very hard to say that Lila Rose is waging a war on women. You have young, articulate, attractive young women explaining why abortion is harmful to women and harmful for children. You have groups like Feminists for Life, groups like Silent No More, talking about what the consequences were of women who had abortions and regret their abortions. Fathers who lost their paternity, lost their children, and lost the opportunity to be parents. That was all revolutionary for the pro-life movement because it changed the narrative. And you can argue about statistics, you can argue about philosophy. It's hard to discount someone's story. So that's why the left always tried to say that Barbara Boxer and Nancy Pelosi speaks for all women. Right? And that's why Helen Alvarez needed a group, Women Speak for Themselves, because the media wanted to say it was these elected officials who were fully in the pro-abortion camp who were speaking for all women. Not true. Same thing on the marriage question. The media wants to say that Andrew Sullivan speaks for all gay people, and that Zach Walls speak for all children of gay couples. Neither of those things are true. So in the, I forget which chapter it is, I tell some of the stories of gay people who have now come out against gay marriage, and children of same-sex couples who say, we love our two moms or two dads, but we wish we would have had both a mom and a dad. And I want to share one of those stories with you in the time that we have here. It's Heather Barwick. Heather is probably now in her late 30s, maybe early 40s. She was raised by two mothers. So when you think about the book title, Heather Has Two Mommies, that was her reality. She loves her two moms. She was in favor of same-sex marriage. She wanted her two mothers to have the legal right to get married. It was only after she got married to a man and saw how her husband was fathering their children that she was able to articulate what she had missed out on by not having a father. It was the first time in her own life that she fully understood what it was that she missed out. She had two great moms, she says, but the two best moms in the world can't replace a missing dad. So she then changed her position on same-sex marriage. She went from being in favor of it to being against it, and she wrote a public essay about this. She wrote an essay explaining why she was no longer in favor of gay marriage, and she suffered for it. She's gotten lots of hate mail, lots of attacks, in the same way that Mark Regnerus has, in the same way that anyone who speaks the truth in our culture will. And she came up with a phrase that I thought was very clarifying. It helped my own thinking on this. She says, redefining marriage creates an institution for missing parents. That the law teaches, and the law would now be incentivizing two mothers or two fathers as if it's the same thing as a mother and a father. And she compared it to single parenting and to divorce parenting. And she says, no one incentivizes and encourages and promotes single parenting or divorce parenting. We don't have programs out there that are trying to get people to be single parents or divorced parents. No one says, well, when I grow up, I hope my kid, I hope she'll be a single mom. I hope he'll be a divorced dad. We don't have institutions for missing parents like that with those respects. With the exception of some bad welfare programs. I mean, there are unfortunate consequences to some of our policies, but no one intended that. She said redefining marriage actually creates an institution for these missing parents. And what it then does is it stigmatizes the child. So Bobby Lopez, a bisexual man who was one of the first to say, after Mark Regnerus published his report, he said, his data tells the story of my life. He wrote an essay titled, Growing Up with Two Moms, The Untold Child's Story. And what he's done is he's done studies showing that second generation children of same-sex couples are now being told by therapists and mental health professionals that they are the problem if they express a desire for the missing parent. He says that a generation ago, if you were being raised by two mothers and you said, well, I kind of miss a father, they would sympathize with you and they would try to make arrangements, they would empathize with you. Today, if you're being raised by two mothers and you're a child and you say, well, I'm missing a father, the therapist, the counselor will say, well, you have internalized homophobia. The problem's not with your family structure, the problem's with you. And that your two moms or your two dads is the same thing as a mom and a dad. And so Bobby Lopez filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court reporting on this, that one of the things that redefining marriage will do will stigmatize children in addition to creating the institution for the missing parent. We need to learn these stories. We need to be able to share these stories. Doug Mainwaring is another story you should know. He's a gay man who came out against gay marriage, saying that just because I'm attracted to other men is no reason to deny my children a relationship with a mother. These personal narratives can help shift the way that this is framed. Fourth idea in this subsection. The pro-life movement created grassroots support centers, crisis pregnancy centers, Project Rachel, various things to help women who are facing unplanned pregnancies. You look at the Sisters of Life, look at various groups that are out there providing tangible support to women who are contemplating abortions. If we're not in favor of same-sex marriage for people with same-sex attractions, what are we in favor of? And so what does that look like? What does our response look like to people who have same-sex attractions? This is another area where I think you guys are doing a great job. The website, is it Gay and Mormon or Gays and Mormons? I forget if it's plural or singular. Richard and I were talking about it just before this. is providing a forum for these sorts of conversations to take place. Within my own church, it's called the ministry Courage. Justice Scalia's son, Father Paul Scalia, is a chaplain within that organization. This is meant to provide people with the courage to live out the truth of their sexuality, even when doing so may be challenging. So it's going to be important that we have like formal institutions and programs to help minister to people with same-sex attractions. It's also important that we do things like this, right? We can't just outsource it to a monthly meeting at our church or to a program with a professional. There's a universal human desire for meaningful relationships, for friendships, for companionship. For people who are not going to marry for whatever reason, possibly because of same-sex attraction, possibly because of other things that prevent it, what are we doing to help welcome them into our own families? When Thanksgiving and Christmas come around, are we inviting people to celebrate the holidays at our dining room table? I don't know if Mormons have godparents and godmothers, godfathers. Catholics, we do. Are we inviting someone who may not have a child of their own to be a godparent to our children? Are we finding ways of helping to create meaningful relationships and community without redefining what marriage is? We need to be thinking creatively about what we can do on that answer. Lastly, for this, and then I'm going to close and get to your questions, we have to live out the truth. The reason I opened by turning back the clock 50 years was to say that it's only because of our misbehavior, our bad example, our failure to live out the truth about marriage for 2 generations, that we could now be in a position that marriage would be legally redefined. So one of the things that we have to do is simply support, encourage, develop programs to help people form the right moral imagination about their sexual lives, their familial lives, so they can live out the truth, even in a culture that's going to be stigmatizing that. We're going to be living in a hostile culture for the foreseeable future. What can we do to form our own children, our own communities, to be able to live out the truth about marriage? And obviously here, the LDS community has a lot to teach the rest of us. When you look at the rates of marriage within your community, they're the highest, they're the strongest. You look at some of Utah's rates on family structure, dependency, non-marital childbearing. You have some of the best statistics on this. You look at the programs that you're doing inside of your church communities. The rest of us have a lot to learn from you. And I mention this for 2 reasons. First comes from, as a Catholic, I have to quote Pope, so let me mention 2, and then I'll be done. And that is a joke, so thank you for laughing. Pope Benedict, a world-class theologian, a world-class intellectual, he says it's not the arguments of the intellectuals that win converts, it's the lives of the saints, and it's the beauty of the artists. And it's all the more powerful coming from Benedict because he is a world-class intellectual. He knows it's necessary to do that part of the puzzle, and that's obviously the part of the puzzle that I can make contributions to. You wouldn't want to listen to my music. And hopefully I can live out this and be a saint, lowercase s, if not capital S. What Benedict's getting at here is that all of us have a vocation to holiness, and it's going to be our own families, our own lived holiness that will be the best apologetic, the best defense for marriage going forward. And I think that we can all make that contribution. And then lastly, John Paul II. John Paul did a diagnosis of the 20th century. He says, what's gone wrong in the 20th century is that we have a bad understanding of the human person. Whereas earlier times in the church, a focus might have been really on Trinitarian theology or ecclesiology, things like that. Today's big debates focus on anthropology. Today's debates focus on the nature of the human person. And obviously that has implications for theology, and theology has implications for that. He said that as we've eclipsed God, we've denigrated man. That the 20th century, with the death of God, with the eclipse of God, meant a diminishment of that creature who's made in the image and likeness of God. And that's what gave us the 2 world wars. It's what gave us the Holocaust, the Gulag, the killing fields, the totalitarian regimes. It's also what gave us abortion on demand and embryo-destructive research and the redefinition of marriage and the rise of transgender ideology. What all of those phenomena do is they get 3 central truths wrong. 3 central truths right from the beginning of the book of Genesis. That we're created in the image and likeness of God, 1, true that we're created male and female, and 3, that male and female are created for each other. If you look at the challenges of our generation, it's going to be those 3 truths in particular that are going to need defending. They're going to need defending at the intellectual level, philosophy, theology, social science, psychology, psychiatry, and they're going to need defending at the practical level, simply living them out, being a witness. And that's where I think the lives of holiness will be our long-term best defense. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I will let Richard tell us how much time we have for questions. I know we started a little late, so I don't know when we need to wrap up, but
We have about 5 minutes.
5 minutes, perfect.
Okay, so I really appreciate the model and metaphor using the Roe v. Wade decision as a way of understanding moving forward with the marriage equality decision, and I'm curious, based off of what you've studied, where you see potential breakdowns in that model or metaphor, just with the fact that an abortion and marrying a same-sex couple are not the same and have many differences. So I'm curious where. Does that make sense?
Yep, no, that's a great question, and it's probably one of the best follow-up questions, because it's an analogy, but every analogy also has disanalogies. You know, it's not a univocal relationship, it's an analogical relationship. I think the largest disconnect would be the nature of the harm at stake here. We have a bumper sticker phrase, abortion stops a beating heart. We have an ultrasound image that we can show. The American discourse, the nature of American discourse, is about rights and harms. For better or worse, unfortunately, I think for worse, that's what we've inherited from Locke and from Mill, and it's the nature of how Americans talk about politics. So I have a right to X, Y, and Z unless it causes you harm in PDQ situations. We can argue the abortion question very well in that frame. The child has a right to life because abortion stops a beating heart. It causes harm to the child. The right here is a child's right. With marriage, we're not talking directly about either rights or harms. Both are at stake, but they're more derivative. What we're primarily talking about is an institution. We're talking about a society. And we're talking about an institution that helps promote human flourishing. And all 3 of those terms, institution, society, human flourishing, are much more foreign to American discourse. They're common to the Aristotelian tradition of political philosophy, but most people haven't been formed in the Aristotelian tradition of political philosophy. That was one of the rhetorical challenges for us in the marriage debate in general. Because the other side can say, well, we're in favor of marriage equality. How does Adam and Steve getting married cause you any harm? And we had to explain multi-steps. There is an answer to that question, and Professor George and I and various others have tried to provide direct responses, but you actually have to think about how redefining marriage redefines parenting, which in turn will redefine childhood, which will also redefine how children are even created and conceived. But those are certain steps in an argument, and there's not quite yet that bumper sticker slogan. So that's what I would say is the biggest disanalogy. It's not that redefining marriage doesn't cause harms. It's not that it doesn't deprive a child of a right to both a mother and a father. It's that it takes more steps to help people to see this. The reason why Professor George gave an hour-long lecture last night, the reason I'm doing an hour-long lecture this morning, is that we need lots of dots that need to be connected. Which is simply to say that there's more work for you to do. So you can also view that as a good thing. Whereas the pro-lifers have done all of this work, now there's a new issue on which everyone in this room has some way of contributing to. Right? Some of you will contribute with scholarship, some of you will contribute with grassroots activism, some of you will just contribute by living it out in your own lives. But we can help connect those dots for people so that they can see what's at stake in this debate.
Last question, then. We got to stay on schedule here.
Huge fan of your work, first of all, but my question is it, you say we need to make allies of the regular liberals in the religious liberty debate, which is, I think, a fantastic idea. My question is it worth fighting the media in this, because they seem like such a huge monolithic enemy of that? I'm thinking about when you were on like the Piers Morgan show and they tried to boo you off, basically, and they misrepresent everything that we have to say. So how can we overcome that, basically?
Good question. I think the answer to both parts of your question is going to be in the affirmative. Yes, I do think we need to make those strategic alliances. So I think it's a good thing that Ilya Shapiro, he's a friend of mine, he works at the Cato Institution. Cato is a libertarian think tank. Ilya filed a brief in favor of gay marriage. And he and I debated this at Yale Law School. I think he's fundamentally wrong about that issue. And we'll continue to debate it, and we'll continue to disagree, while we're agreeing that Barronelle Stutzman should win her appeal at the Washington State Supreme Court. He doesn't think Barronelle Stutzman should be fined to make these flowers for the same-sex wedding. So I do think strategically it's important that we can say we still disagree about marriage, but we can agree about protecting the right to disagree about marriage. We can agree about protecting the right of the baker, the florist, the photographer, BYU's law school, Gordon College, the Catholic Adoption Agency. On the media question, I think we need to, one, not be our own enemies. We sometimes give the media ammunition on this. And it's not just the Westboro Baptist Church, but I mean, this is something where all of us need to think about how we can be the best ambassadors for our viewpoints. And then two, we have to engage them. There are some people in the media who are ideologically driven and they want to spin the story, but not everyone in the media is that way. And I've been able to develop relationships with producers and with journalists who have given me a fair shake. Piers Morgan, not so much. But the Washington Post did a front page story about work that I was doing on marriage, and it was impartial to a fault. It was so impartial that the journalist was being criticized by liberals for spinning the story in my favor. And I think that just requires work. So rather than saying, well, we're going to write off the mainstream media, what we all need to be doing is how can we actually reach out to those honest brokers in the mainstream media and help them see our side of this? Because sometimes they don't fully understand our arguments because our arguments are complicated and they are connecting dots, and all they've heard are the bad talking points from the Westboro Baptist Church. They need to see, well, wait, there's actually an argument here. How can I now present that argument to my readers or to my viewers? George Stephanopoulos, when he saw that Washington Post front page story, said to his producer, get me this guy on the show this Sunday. And so we had an 8-minute discussion, and he was by far the most even-handed host of any show I went on, and that's by far the one that had the largest audience. It's on ABC News Sunday morning, which is just to say I think we need to be doing more of that. I need to be doing more of it. I think all of us who have opportunities to engage the most elite sectors of academy and of media need to be doing what we can there, because we can't give up on those domains. They influence lots of people.